General Hospital spoilers tease that Willow had spent months convincing herself that Michael was fine, or at least healing. After the explosion that nearly claimed his life and left him with third-degree burns, she had expected some lingering trauma, physical or otherwise. But what she hadn't anticipated was the quiet erosion of the man she once knew, a slow, insidious transformation masked beneath routines, obligations, and the weight of fatherhood. It began with small things, Michael forgetting appointments, growing irritable over insignificant issues, or sleeping through moments he would have cherished before. Daisy's first smile. Her first steps, he was present, but detached, as if his body was in the room while his mind drifted somewhere unreachable. Willow initially attributed it to exhaustion. After all, raising a child while carrying the burden of public scrutiny, the trauma of being Sonny's son, and the emotional wreckage of their dissolved marriage would crush even the strongest spirit. But the truth ran deeper than fatigue. The truth revealed itself one quiet afternoon when Willow returned to Michael's place to drop off Daisy's blanket. He wasn't expecting her. His apartment was dimly lit, the air thick with the bitter scent of something medicinal. She followed the sound of running water to the bathroom, where she caught a glimpse of Michael slumped on the floor, hand trembling as he reached for a bottle of oxycodone, his shirt damp with sweat, his eyes distant and glazed. He didn't see her at first. But when he did, the look on his face wasn't embarrassment, it was panic. That moment shattered everything. All the assumptions, all the hope that Michael had pulled himself together. All the lies he had told to keep her at arm's length, it all came crashing down. Willow didn't speak immediately. She didn't scream or cry. Instead, she walked out, clutching Daisy's blanket to her chest like it could protect her from the truth. Later, when she gathered the strength to confront him, Michael tried to explain. He spoke of the pain he still felt. Not just in his body but in his memories. He spoke of waking in the middle of the night, hearing the echo of the explosion. Of seeing Christina's terrified face as she pounded on the glass of Charlie's pub. He admitted he had tried to manage it without help, that the hospital had offered counseling, but he declined, thinking he could carry it all on his own. He thought the painkillers would be temporary, just for the worst days. But the worst days kept coming. Willow listened, heartbreaking, as the man she once loved confessed to a secret he had buried beneath a facade of stability. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that he still had the strength to climb out of this abyss. But she was a mother now, not just to her own heart, but to Daisy's, and she couldn't allow herself to be blinded by love or loyalty. Michael's addiction wasn't just his battle anymore. It was a threat to the fragile peace Daisy needed. It was a ticking clock counting down to the moment something irreversible might happen. What if he was alone with Daisy during a relapse? What if he nodded off behind the wheel with her in the back seat? What if the wrong person found out first, someone like Drew, who could use it in a custody battle, or someone like Sidwell, who could twist Michael's vulnerability into leverage? Willow stood at a crossroads. She could intervene gently, plead with Michael to seek professional help, to check into a treatment center, to allow Jason or even Sonny to step in and support him. Or she could go to the court and request full custody of Daisy, protect her daughter from the man who, in his silent suffering, had become unpredictable. The decision weighed heavily on her. She loved Michael. A part of her always would. He had been her partner, her protector, her salvation during times she thought she'd break. But now he was the one in pieces, and love alone couldn't fix that. She needed to decide whether she would be his lifeline, or Daisy's shield. And as Willow sat alone in her apartment that night, Daisy asleep in the next room, she pulled out her phone and stared at the contact list. Her thumb hovered over Jason's name. She knew he would help. He always had. But calling him meant opening Pandora's box. It meant bringing everything into the light, Michael's addiction, his instability, the secrets he fought so hard to keep hidden. It meant tearing down the illusion of control Michael had so carefully crafted. And yet, it might be the only way to save him before the addiction swallowed him whole. Because the truth was no longer just a whisper. It was a scream in Willow's mind. Michael was not okay. And if no one intervened, it wouldn't be long before the pain he was numbing turned into destruction that no one could walk away from unscathed. Michael's descent into unpredictability was no longer a private matter. It had begun to ripple outward in ways that no one around him could ignore. There was a time when he was the beacon of calm amidst the storm, the heir who could balance the legacy of the Corinthos crime dynasty with the ruthless intellect of the Quartermaines. The one who walked the tightrope between morality and necessity without falling. But now, that version of Michael was slowly eroding. Replaced by a man trapped within the tightening grip of pain and secrecy, spiraling through a darkness that even he no longer seemed to recognize. Every choice he made carried a dissonant edge. Like he was both pushing people away and begging for someone to pull him back before he drowned completely. His addiction to painkillers. Born from the very real agony of third-degree burns after the rooftop explosion, had evolved into something far more sinister, an obsession, a dependency. A quiet monster that whispered false promises of control while robbing him of clarity and reason with every dose. Willow had once believed that if she gave him space to heal, Michael would find his way back to the man he used to be, the man who fought to keep their family safe, the father who once held Daisy like she was his redemption. But the more she watched, the more she realized that Michael wasn't healing, he was hiding. The way he flinched when someone touched his shoulder, the way he turned away from mirrors as if afraid of what he'd see. The way his hands shook slightly even in moments of calm, these were not the signs of someone managing pain. These were the signs of someone being consumed by it. His lies became more frequent. More casual. He told Willow he'd been working late when he hadn't left the house. He told Jason he was fine, just tired, then missed a key meeting at ELQ without explanation. Even his appearance was changing, darker circles beneath his eyes, a tension in his jaw that never relaxed, a stillness in his voice that wasn't peace, but fatigue. It was as if Michael was preparing for war, but no one could tell who the enemy was, the world around him, or himself. Jason, ever watchful and loyal, had begun to question whether the Michael he knew was slipping away. He approached him gently at first, suggesting counseling, asking about the pain, the memories, the trauma, but Michael deflected with charm and sarcasm, changing the subject or shifting blame. Yet Jason knew the signs too well. He'd seen them in Sunny after Morgan died, in Sam during her breakdown, even in himself after too many nights with blood on his hands and no answers to justify it. What frightened Jason wasn't just the pills, it was the detachment. Michael wasn't angry. He was empty. And that kind of emptiness in a man with access to power, money, and influence was a powder keg waiting to explode. Christina, whose near-death experience at Charlie's pub had already shaken the Corinthos family to its core, began voicing her own concerns, noticing how distant Michael had become. How cold his interactions were, even with Daisy. She tried to reach him through compassion, through shared pain, but Michael had mastered the art of smiling just enough to dismiss her. Sensing that something in her world was wrong. Not when Drew began noticing inconsistencies in Michael's financial decisions. Like donations made to obscure clinics and cash withdrawals with no traceable purpose. Not when Monica received a private message from a colleague at GH expressing concern that Michael had tried to refill a prescription not meant for long-term use, only to learn that it had already been filled elsewhere under an alias. And not when a locked drawer in Michael's study was found ajar by Brooke Lynn, who had only wanted to leave him a note, and instead saw the edge of a pill bottle hidden beneath a stack of documents. Whispers turned to confrontations. Confrontations turned to warnings. But Michael, instead of accepting help, began weaponizing his pain, accusing those closest to him of betrayal, of trying to control him, of not understanding what he carried on his shoulders. The tipping point came when he nearly lashed out at Sasha during a tense conversation about Daisy's schedule. His voice, once measured and calm, rose in a tremor of rage that left even Sasha frozen. The fear in her eyes jolted something in Willow, but not in Michael. He apologized, of course. Claimed it was stress. Promised it wouldn't happen again. But promises from a man in denial are illusions. And illusions break. Port Charles had seen this before: addiction, breakdown, the unraveling of legacy and identity, but never like this. Never with someone like Michael. His pain was buried beneath privilege, his suffering masked by inherited power. But now that pain had a life of its own, crawling through every part of his existence, pulling him further from the light and closer to something no one dared name. Willow stood at a crossroads, knowing that if she didn't act soon, Daisy's father might disappear into a version of himself they would never recover. But every path forward was dangerous: confront him and risk his wrath, or stay silent and risk losing him entirely. And as Michael stared at himself in the mirror one sleepless night, pale, haunted, clutching a bottle of pills like it held the answers to every question he was too afraid to ask, he whispered a truth even he could barely admit: he didn't know how to stop. And worse, part of him didn't want to. Willow was no longer the same fragile figure who once clung to hope in silence. She had been reshaped by pain, betrayal, and the cold realization that her children's futures were slipping from her grasp. The latest shifts in her world had forced her into an awakening both devastating and empowering. The revelations surrounding Michael's painkiller addiction had struck her like a hammer, but what followed was even more terrifying. The knowledge that his instability could jeopardize not only his own life but also the emotional well-being and safety of Wiley and Amelia. This was no longer a quiet tragedy she could manage with whispered prayers and emotional tolerance. This had become a battlefield, and Willow, once hesitant to confront, now found herself preparing for a custody war she never imagined she'd have to fight. There had been signs, of course: Michael's unexplained absences, his short temper, his hollow eyes, but Willow had clung to the hope that he would recover quietly, that he would choose help, that the man who once fought beside her for their family would find his footing again. But the fantasy could no longer shield her from the truth. She had to act. And as the legal implications of his behavior mounted: missed parenting schedules, inconsistent stories, financial mismanagement, Willow knew the time had come to protect her children from the fallout of Michael's unraveling. Her concern transformed into resolve. She met with attorneys, gathered medical reports, and reviewed court documents. What began as fear evolved into determination, and with each new piece of evidence she obtained, she fortified her case, not out of vengeance, but out of maternal instinct, out of a fierce, blazing need to ensure Wiley and Amelia were raised in a stable, healthy environment. Michael, meanwhile, was spinning deeper into his own chaos, blind to the storm he had unleashed upon himself. His addiction had become a shadow entity, whispering justifications into his ear, fueling his paranoia, and making him believe that everyone, including Willow, was turning against him. His need for control, once subtle and strategic, now erupted in unpredictable bursts, alienating him from his support system and casting a chilling light on the depth of his psychological spiral. But the more he fought to keep control, the more he lost it. He couldn't see that the battle Willow was preparing wasn't about punishing him, it was about saving the children he claimed to love. And that blindness, that refusal to confront the truth, became his greatest vulnerability. For Willow, this was not just a legal fight, it was an emotional reckoning. The betrayal cut deeper because she had once believed in Michael's strength, admired his integrity, even loved him through moments of doubt. But now, as she stood on the precipice of a custody war, she had to transform that love into clarity, that grief into strategy. She documented the late-night outbursts, the missed school functions, the inconsistencies in his medication records, and the ways he'd begun isolating himself from Amelia and Wiley, behaviors that proved not just unreliability, but danger. And as she prepared her statement for court, Willow no longer wept, she steadied her voice, put pen to paper, and painted the truth of what was happening inside the walls of the Corinthos estate. The system had failed her before, but she would not fail her children. Yet even as she fought, Willow knew the road ahead would be far from clean. Michael had powerful allies, people who would defend him blindly, out of love, guilt, or loyalty. He had resources, connections, and the ability to spin the narrative. But what he lacked now was credibility. His own spiral had become public. The community had started whispering, Family members had begun asking questions they once feared to raise. And the once unshakable image of Michael as the righteous heir was beginning to crumble. In contrast, Willow's image sharpened: mother, protector, survivor. And though the war she was about to wage would be brutal, she had something stronger than vengeance in her arsenal: the truth. As the custody hearing loomed on the horizon, tension built like a gathering storm in Port Charles. Friends picked sides. Secrets threatened to spill. And through it all, Willow stood unwavering. Knowing that the man she was now fighting wasn't a stranger, he was the father of her children, the man she once trusted with her life. And now, in the name of those children, she would fight to take that life back. Michael was no longer the composed figure the people of Port Charles had once known. Every step he took was now a battle. Every breath marked by the haunting sting of pain that refused to subside. The burns from the explosion had left more than just scars on his skin, they had embedded themselves deep into his nervous system, into his psyche, into the very foundation of who he thought he was. At first, he had managed to keep it at bay with a strict regimen, following doctor's orders, leaning on physical therapy, even allowing himself moments of vulnerability behind closed doors. But over time, the pain evolved, became less predictable, more suffocating, more demanding. And with it, Michael began to slip. Slowly, then all at once. What had once been a calculated coping mechanism, taking a pill here, another there, just enough to get through a day, morphed into something more consuming, something more dangerous. The lines between relief and craving blurred, and Michael, once a beacon of self-discipline, began to lose grip on the very identity he'd built. He wasn't just numbing physical pain anymore. He was drowning in a cocktail of suppressed trauma, mounting expectations, and the quiet horror of realizing he was no longer in control of his own body, or his own choices. Each dosage became less about healing and more about surviving the day. And yet, even as he spiraled, he denied it. Denied the dependency. Denied the warnings. Denied the worried eyes of those closest to him. But Drew and Willow saw it. They saw everything. Drew, who had fought beside Michael in business and in battle, now looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and concern. There had been a time when Drew admired Michael's resilience, how he could carry the weight of a broken family and still show up for the people he loved. But now? Now he saw a man unraveling. A man making dangerous choices, a man who could no longer be trusted with the reins of power or the future of his children. Drew, always a strategist, began preparing for what he saw as the inevitable, a confrontation, a shift in alliances, perhaps even a public intervention. Willow, meanwhile, was wrestling with a different kind of grief, the grief of watching the man she once believed in become a stranger. She had spent months trying to rationalize his behavior, to forgive the mood swings, the forgotten appointments, the excuses. She had begged him to seek help, to be honest, to face his demons. But Michael had pushed her away, accusing her of betrayal, of not understanding his pain. Now, with their relationship fractured and trust hanging by a thread, Willow no longer waited for Michael to save himself. She took action. She documented his behavior. She built a legal case. And most painfully, she prepared for the possibility that she might have to take her children and walk away forever. Michael, in his haze, sensed the shift. The way Drew looked at him now with guarded suspicion. The way Willow flinched when he entered a room. He saw the whispers, the worried glances. The quiet conversations that stopped when he approached. And it made him furious. Not at them, but at himself. At his weakness. At the pain. At the pills. But instead of reaching out, he dug in deeper. Becoming more erratic, more volatile. He lashed out at Drew, accusing him of betrayal. He called Willow manipulative, convinced she was using his pain against him. But underneath the bravado was fear. The fear of losing everything. The fear of being exposed. The fear that he was no longer the hero in anyone's story, but the cautionary tale. As tensions boiled and the pressure mounted, Port Charles watched silently, collectively holding its breath. Michael's descent wasn't just a personal crisis anymore, it was a ticking time bomb. And both Drew and Willow, once his greatest allies, were now preparing for the fallout, even if it meant standing against the man they had once sworn to protect. Michael's descent into the depths of addiction had become more than a private struggle. It was a ticking time bomb threatening to destroy the delicate balance that had long held the Corinthos and Quor Tremaine families together. What began as a medically prescribed solution to manage third-degree burn pain had transformed into a dark, unrelenting dependency that seeped into every aspect of his life. The sharp, searing pain he endured after the rooftop explosion was real. The trauma undeniable, but what had evolved in the aftermath was far more dangerous than any physical wound. Michael, once composed and measured, was now consumed by a need that blurred the lines between necessity and obsession. He was haunted by the memory of fire, the screams in the dark, Christina's near death, the collapse of the ceiling above him, but worse was the silence that followed. In that silence, his painkillers became companions, a crutch for both body and mind, until he no longer remembered what it felt like to face a day without them. And as the drugs took hold of his nervous system, they also hijacked his sense of reason, loyalty, and love. His interactions with Willow had become colder, tinged with paranoia and irrational bursts of temper. He started accusing her of betrayal for simply questioning his health. He began slipping away from important meetings at ELQ, arriving late or not at all, and when he did show up, his pupils were dilated, his words slow, his thoughts disjointed. Ned noticed. Brooke Lynn noticed. Even Monica, before her abrupt departure, raised concerns to Jason. But Jason, ever the quiet observer, watched as Michael's once steady hands trembled uncontrollably during a board meeting. That was the moment he knew this wasn't just stress, this was something far worse. Jason's loyalty had always been to the Corinthos bloodline, and now it was his godson in crisis. But what haunted him more was the question, how had none of them seen this coming sooner? For Carly, the realization was devastating. She had watched Morgan unravel before her very eyes and ultimately lose his life in the explosion that marked one of the darkest chapters of her life. Now, to see Michael, the son who was supposed to carry the legacy forward, teetering on the same precipice was almost too much to bear. She confronted him in the living room of the Quatermain mansion, her voice shaking, tears threatening to fall, but Michael dismissed her with venomous words he would never have said before the addiction. I'm not Morgan, and I don't need saving. That was when Carly knew. This wasn't Michael speaking, it was the pills, the haze, the torment disguised as confidence. She reached out to Sonny, who had been quietly investigating Marco, Sidwell, and the bombing. Sonny, overwhelmed by the weight of retaliation and Christina's trauma, hadn't seen how much his own son had suffered beneath it all. Sonny blamed himself. He always would. Michael had been exposed to violence, secrets, betrayals, and the cost of those secrets had finally come due. Sonny started taking steps. Quiet ones at first. He reached out to old contacts to get Michael's prescription history. He spoke with doctors. He asked Jason to quietly monitor Michael's behavior. But the spiral was faster than anyone could have predicted. Michael began hallucinating. He started seeing flashes of fire, of Daisy crying, of the walls caving in around him. He began doubting Willow's intentions, believing she and Drew were plotting against him to steal Wiley and Amelia. In a fog of confusion and rage, he locked himself in his office one night and didn't come out until the next morning. Security found him passed out on the floor, barely breathing, a half-empty bottle of painkillers clenched in his hand. That incident, hidden from the public, shattered the last illusions of safety. Willow had tried to protect Michael from himself for weeks, shielding him from scrutiny, downplaying his behavior, but now she could no longer lie, to herself or the court. With Amelia and Wiley's safety at stake, she began speaking to her lawyers. Jason, who had carried out an intervention with Michael only to be met with hostility and defiance, started planning for contingencies. Drew, who once admired Michael's tenacity, now saw a threat to his own future with Willow and the children. He weaponized the incident, preparing to use Michael's overdose against him in court if needed. Willow, torn between love and responsibility, found herself in the unbearable position of having to choose what was right over what was loyal. But the fallout didn't stop there. Sunny and Carly, desperate to avoid another public tragedy, began quietly discussing inpatient rehabilitation options, knowing full well Michael would resist. Christina, struggling with her own trauma from the fire, began distancing herself from Michael, fearful of his unpredictability. Brooke Lynn, having suffered enough familial heartbreak, refused to speak on Michael's behalf when the custody hearings began. Even Olivia, usually a pillar of maternal compassion, begged Carly to intervene before Michael hurt himself, or worse, the children. In court, Michael tried to present himself as competent and healthy. But the evidence mounted against him: missed doctor appointments, inconsistencies in his medication logs, eyewitnesses to his instability. The judge began to lean toward awarding sole custody to Willow. For Michael, it was a catastrophic betrayal. In his mind, Willow had abandoned him when he needed her most. He stormed out of the courtroom, disappearing for days, ignoring calls, only to be found again, this time in a seedy motel outside of Port Charles, unconscious, with no memory of how he got there. The relapse was undeniable. The consequences, unavoidable. Sunny, facing the possibility of losing yet another child to the abyss, made the painful choice to issue a psychiatric hold on Michael. He signed the paperwork himself. Carly screamed at him, torn between fury and gratitude, and Jason stood by, knowing this may be the only way to save what was left of the boy he once held in his arms. Michael awoke in a treatment center, disoriented, strapped to a hospital bed, a mirror above his head reflecting a stranger's face. That was the first time he cried, not because he was in pain, but because he could no longer remember the last time he wasn't. And as Willow held Amelia that night and watched Wiley sleep beside her, she whispered to herself the truth she had fought so long to avoid: the man she once loved was gone, and only time would tell if he could ever come back. In the shadows of the Corinthos and Quartermain legacy, addiction had claimed yet another soul, and with it, the illusion that any of them were untouchable.